My wife and I had always loved the idea of living in a place with history, a building that had seen years of lives passing through its walls. So when we found the old apartment on Marshall Street, it felt like fate. It was a sprawling pre-war building with high ceilings and an odd labyrinthine layout that intrigued us. The rent was cheap, suspiciously so, but we chalked it up to the building's age and lack of modern amenities. We were young, just married, and eager to start a life together in a place we could call our own. The day we moved in, the weather was unusually warm for late September. The sun cast golden light through the high windows, giving the place a warm, welcoming glow. We were unpacking boxes in our new living room when we first heard it. A faint, distant sobbing. I paused, looking at Sarah. "Did you hear that?" I asked. She stopped mid-unpacking, listening intently. The sound was so faint that it was easy to dismiss it as a trick of the acoustics, maybe the pipes groaning in the old walls. "Old buildings make weird noises," Sarah said, smiling a little too brightly. "Let's not start getting spooked already." But the noise nagged at me, tugging at the edges of my mind. I forced myself to ignore it, but it seemed to follow us around the apartment, always distant, always just on the edge of hearing. By nightfall, it had faded, and we were too exhausted to care. The building had 2 stairwells. The main one was wide and grand, with marble steps worn smooth by decades of footfalls. The other was narrow, utilitarian, and led straight to the back alley, a more direct route to the street. It was also unnaturally cold. I noticed it the first time I used it. I had run down to grab a pizza from a nearby shop, and on my way back up I felt it. A chill that cut through the warm September night like a knife. The stairwell was dark and narrow, the kind of space that seemed to press in on you. My breath misted in front of me, and I shivered despite the warmth outside. I shrugged it off, chalking it up to poor insulation or drafts from old windows. But every time we passed by that stairwell, the temperature dropped. It was the middle of summer, but that stairwell felt like the dead of winter. Then there was the sobbing. It grew louder, more distinct. By the second week, it was no longer something we could ignore. It was a woman's voice, low and mournful, echoing up from the depths of the building. "Maybe it's someone in the building," Sarah suggested one night, though she didn't sound convinced. "Someone who's going through a rough time." "Maybe," I replied, though deep down I knew it wasn't that simple. The sound wasn't just from one place. It seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once, and it was only ever there when we passed by the back stairwell. We started avoiding that part of the building. It was easy enough during the day when we were both out at work, but at night, the layout of the apartment funneled us past the stairwell on our way in and out. The cold seemed to seep under the door, and the sobbing became a nightly occurrence, a ritual of unease that neither of us dared to acknowledge. The tipping point came on a Sunday evening. We had just returned from a dinner date, trying to shake off the gloom that had settled over our lives since moving in. As we climbed the stairs, the sobbing grew louder, more desperate. I felt the hair on the back of my neck stand on end. "We have to check it out," Sarah said suddenly, her voice trembling but determined. "What?" I stopped in my tracks, staring at her in disbelief. "We can't keep ignoring it," she said, her eyes wide with fear but also a strange resolve. "What if someone's hurt? What if they need help?" I wanted to argue, to tell her that we should just go back to the apartment and lock the door, but something in her voice wouldn't let me. Reluctantly, I nodded. We made our way to the back stairwell. The closer we got, the colder it became. I could see my breath now, small clouds of mist in the dim light. The sobbing was louder than ever, echoing off the narrow walls. We reached the door at the bottom of the stairs, and I felt a wave of nausea. It was chained shut from the outside. Thick, rusted chains looped through the door handles, secured with a heavy padlock. "Who would do this?" Sarah whispered, her voice trembling. I shook my head, unable to answer. The sobbing was louder now, coming from just beyond the door. It was a horrible, gut-wrenching sound that made my skin crawl. My hands were shaking as I reached out, grasping the cold metal of the chains. "Wait," Sarah said, placing her hand on mine. "Are you sure about this?" I wasn't. Every instinct in my body screamed to leave, to get out while we still could. But something was pulling me forward, a compulsion I couldn't explain. I nodded. It took us nearly an hour to pry the chains loose. The padlock was ancient and rusted, and the chains clanked against the door with every movement, the sound reverberating in the cold stairwell. Finally, with a groan of metal, the chains fell away, clattering to the floor. I hesitated for a moment, then slowly pushed the door open. The sobbing stopped abruptly, leaving a silence that was somehow even more terrifying. The basement beyond was pitch black. I fumbled for my phone, switching on the flashlight. The beam cut through the darkness, revealing a space that hadn't seen light in decades. Moldy, decaying furniture was scattered around the room, covered in a thick layer of dust. The stench of rot was overwhelming, a sickly sweet odor that clung to the back of my throat. "We should leave," Sarah said, her voice barely above a whisper. But something compelled me to move deeper into the room. My heart was pounding, my breath coming in short, panicked gasps. I felt like I was in a nightmare, unable to wake up, unable to escape. As we turned to leave, the door slammed shut with a deafening bang. We both jumped, spinning around to face it. The darkness pressed in on us, the air growing colder by the second. Then we saw it. At the top of the stairs, just beyond the door, a figure stood. It was tall, impossibly thin, its skin a sickly, pallid gray. Its eyes were hollow, empty sockets that seemed to drink in the light from my phone. Its mouth was twisted into a grotesque, silent scream, the edges pulled back in a rictus of agony. It began to move, slowly descending the stairs. Its limbs jerked unnaturally, as if it were a puppet being pulled by invisible strings. The closer it got, the colder the room became, until I could see frost forming on the walls, the breath freezing in my lungs. I grabbed Sarah's hand, yanking her towards the door. We pulled with all our strength, but it wouldn't budge. The figure was halfway down the stairs now, its hollow eyes locked onto us, its mouth still frozen in that horrible, silent scream. "We have to get out of here," Sarah screamed, pounding on the door with her fists. I turned, searching desperately for another way out, but there was nothing. The room was a dead end, a trap. The figure reached the bottom of the stairs, its movements slow and deliberate, as if savoring the moment. It reached out one skeletal hand, the fingers long and bony, tipped with sharp, blackened nails. In that moment, I knew we were going to die. I didn't think. I just acted. I grabbed one of the moldy chairs, swinging it at the door with all my strength. The wood splintered on impact, and I swung again and again, the noise echoing in the small space. The figure was only a few feet away now, its hand inches from Sarah's face. With a final desperate swing, the chair smashed through the door. I grabbed Sarah, pulling her through the hole. We tumbled into the stairwell, scrambling to our feet as the door slammed shut behind us, the sobbing starting up again, louder and more desperate than ever. We didn't stop running until we were out of the building, the cold night air biting into our skin. We collapsed on the sidewalk, gasping for breath, our hearts pounding in our chests. We never went back to that apartment. We didn't even go back for our things. We just left, leaving behind whatever it was that haunted that stairwell, that basement. To this day, I don't know what we encountered in that building. I don't want to know. All I know is that we escaped with our lives. But sometimes, late at night, when the world is quiet and still, I think I can hear it. The faint, distant sound of sobbing echoing through the darkness. When I first moved into the small apartment complex on the edge of town, I welcomed the quiet. It was a far cry from the bustling city life I had left behind, and the isolation was comforting. The building was old, but the rent was cheap, and the landlord seemed eager to fill the vacancies. I figured it was just one of those places where people came and went, looking for something better. The first note appeared a week after I moved in. It was a simple piece of paper, folded neatly and slipped under my door. The message was handwritten in small, precise letters. Welcome to the neighborhood. Your neighbor. At first, I thought nothing of it. Maybe it was the building's way of being friendly, a little gesture to make new tenants feel at home. I smiled, tossed the note aside, and went about my day. But the notes kept coming. They started appearing every few days, always at odd times. Sometimes I'd find them in the morning when I left for work. Other times they'd be there when I returned in the evening. Each one was signed the same way. Your neighbor. The messages began innocently enough. Nice choice of dinner last night. Your neighbor. Late night reading? You've got good taste in books. Your neighbor. But soon they became more specific, more unsettling. I noticed you've been having trouble sleeping. Those dark circles are getting worse. Your neighbor. I saw you staring at the ceiling last night. What were you thinking about? Your neighbor. My initial amusement faded into unease. How did this person know such intimate details of my life? I started locking my doors more carefully, double-checking the windows. I even asked the other tenants if they had received similar notes, but they all gave me the same puzzled look, shaking their heads. As the days passed, the notes took on a darker tone. They no longer felt like harmless observations, but something more sinister, something invasive. You shouldn't have lied to your boss about being sick. I know you were just hungover. Your neighbor. Why do you keep that picture of her? It's time to move on. Your neighbor. That last one sent a chill down my spine. The picture in question was of my ex-girlfriend, tucked away in a drawer that I rarely opened. I hadn't looked at it in months, but somehow this person knew it was there. I started to suspect everyone. The old lady in 2B with her endless knitting, the couple across the hall who rarely spoke more than a few words, even the landlord with his too wide smile and vague answers. But none of them seemed like the type to play such an elaborate prank. Then I began hearing the footsteps. They started late at night, just after I'd turn off the lights and settle into bed. A slow, deliberate creaking that seemed to come from the ceiling above me. At first I brushed it off as the building settling, or maybe a raccoon that had found its way into the attic. But the footsteps continued, always at the same time, always in the same slow, measured pace. There was no access to the attic from my apartment. I checked, of course. The only entrance was a small, square hatch in the hallway outside my door, sealed with a rusty padlock. Yet every night the footsteps echoed above me, growing louder, more insistent. I knew I had to do something. My nerves were fraying, and the constant sense of being watched, of being scrutinized, was driving me to the edge. I decided to confront whoever was responsible, to put an end to this twisted game. That night, I stayed up late, listening. The footsteps started right on cue, a soft, deliberate creaking directly above my bed. I waited until they faded away, then grabbed a flashlight and a hammer. I was done with the notes, done with the games. I was going to break into that attic and find out what the hell was going on. The hallway was eerily quiet as I approached the hatch. My heart pounded in my chest, each beat echoing in the silence. The padlock was old, the metal rusted and brittle. It only took a few solid hits with the hammer before it broke apart, the chain falling away with a dull clink. I hesitated, my hand on the hatch. What was I expecting to find up there? Some deranged neighbor with a vendetta? Or maybe just a bunch of old junk? The source of all my anxiety, a mere figment of my overactive imagination. Taking a deep breath, I pulled the hatch open and climbed the rickety wooden ladder into the darkness above. The attic was a wide, open space, the air thick with dust and the musty smell of old wood. My flashlight's beam cut through the darkness, revealing piles of discarded furniture, boxes of forgotten belongings, and something that made my blood run cold. In the far corner of the attic, there was a makeshift living space. An old mattress lay on the floor, covered with a tattered blanket. Next to it was a small table, cluttered with newspapers, empty food containers, and a notebook. But it was the walls that caught my attention. Every inch of them was covered in photographs of me. I stumbled back, the light shaking in my hand as I scanned the room. The photos were all of me, taken from different angles at different times of the day. Some were of me sleeping, others of me sitting at my desk or watching TV or reading a book. There were even photos of me in the shower, steam fogging up the lens. A wave of nausea rolled over me as the realization hit. Someone had been living above me, watching me, documenting my every move. I approached the small table, my hands trembling as I picked up the notebook. The pages were filled with notes about me, my habits, my routines, my secrets, things I had never told anyone, not even my closest friends. I flipped through the pages, the writing becoming more erratic, more unhinged as it went on. I watch him every night. He doesn't know I'm here, but he can feel me. I can see it in his eyes, the way he looks around, searching for something he can't see. He's mine now. He belongs to me. The last entry was dated the night before. It simply read, "Tonight." A loud creak echoed through the attic, and I froze. The footsteps, the same slow, deliberate steps I had heard night after night, were approaching. But they weren't coming from above. They were coming from behind me. I spun around, the flashlight beam slicing through the darkness. For a moment, I saw nothing but shadows, my breath coming in ragged gasps. Then I saw him. He stood at the far end of the attic, half hidden in the shadows. His face was gaunt, hollowed out by years of isolation. His clothes were dirty and torn, hanging off his emaciated frame. But it was his eyes that terrified me the most. Wide, unblinking, filled with a madness that I couldn't comprehend. He didn't move. He just stood there, watching me, a twisted smile slowly spreading across his face. "Why?" I managed to choke out, my voice barely more than a whisper. His smile widened, revealing yellowed teeth. "You were lonely," he said, his voice raspy and hoarse from disuse. "I just wanted to keep you company." I backed away, my mind racing, searching for a way out. But he started moving toward me, his steps slow and measured, like the footsteps I had heard above my bed every night. I turned and ran, scrambling down the ladder and slamming the hatch shut behind me. I didn't stop, didn't look back until I was out of the building and in my car, my hands shaking so badly I could barely get the keys into the ignition. I drove away, not caring where I was going, as long as it was far from that place. The police found him the next day, still in the attic, surrounded by his photographs, his notes, his obsession. They told me he had been living there for months, maybe longer. No one knew who he was or where he had come from. But I knew. He was my neighbor, and he had been watching me all along. When I first saw the apartment, I was enchanted. It was an old brick building in a quiet part of town, the kind of place that felt like a refuge from the world. The rent was cheap, almost suspiciously so, but I chalked it up to the building's age and the neighborhood's relative obscurity. I was just starting my new job and needed something affordable, and this little apartment with its creaky wooden floors and tall, narrow windows seemed perfect. The landlord, a wiry man in his 60s named Mr. Johnson, was eager to have me sign the lease. He assured me the building was well maintained, though it clearly hadn't seen any updates in decades. There was something a little off about him, his smile too wide, his eyes too calculating, but I ignored my gut. I was desperate for a place, and this one felt like it could become home. The first few days were blissful. I loved the charm of the old place, the way the sun filtered through the lace curtains in the morning, the way the wooden floors creaked underfoot. It felt like a space with history, a place where lives had unfolded over the years. But soon, little things started happening, things that didn't feel right. At first, it was small. I'd leave my keys on the kitchen counter, only to find them on the coffee table when I got home. Or I'd come back from work and the window that I was sure I'd closed would be slightly ajar, letting in a draft. I brushed it off as me being forgetful or the apartment's old quirks. But then it got worse. I started hearing whispers at night. Faint, almost imperceptible, like someone speaking in another room just out of earshot. The first time I heard it, I thought it was the wind slipping through the old windows, or maybe the pipes groaning in the walls. But the whispers persisted, growing louder each night. One night I woke up to a soft rustling sound, like fabric brushing against the floor. My heart pounded in my chest as I lay there, straining to hear. The whispering was back, and this time it was clearer, more distinct, though I couldn't make out the words. It seemed to be coming from the walls themselves, as if the building was trying to speak to me. The next morning I found my bookshelf had been rearranged. Books that I knew I hadn't touched were in different places, and a framed photo of my family that had been on the shelf was now on the floor, unbroken but lying face down. My skin prickled with unease. I called Mr. Johnson, asking if anyone else had access to my apartment. He assured me that I was the only one with a key and that the building was secure. But his reassurance felt hollow, and I could hear something in his voice, something he wasn't telling me. That evening, I decided to confront him in person. When I brought up the strange occurrences, he shifted uncomfortably, avoiding my gaze. Finally, he sighed and told me something that made my blood run cold. "There was a tenant before you," he said, his voice low, almost a whisper itself. "A young woman like yourself. She disappeared. No one knows what happened to her. Just up and vanished one day. Left all her things behind." I stared at him, disbelief and fear churning in my gut. "And you didn't think to tell me this before I moved in?" He shrugged helplessly. "I didn't want to scare you off. It's not like anyone knows what really happened. People disappear all the time, especially in a big city." That night, I couldn't sleep. The apartment felt different now, the air heavier, the shadows deeper. I kept hearing the whispers, growing louder, more insistent. They were no longer just background noise. They were directed at me, though I still couldn't make out the words. It was as if they were just on the edge of understanding, taunting me with their closeness. The noises in the walls grew more frequent, more intense. It wasn't just whispering anymore. There was a scraping sound, like something sharp being dragged against wood, and soft thuds, as if something, or someone, was moving within the walls themselves. I knew I had to find out what was going on. The idea of a hidden room had been gnawing at me since Mr. Johnson's confession, and I couldn't shake the feeling that there was something in this apartment that I was meant to find. The next day I started searching. I tapped on walls, moved furniture, looking for anything out of place. It wasn't until I reached the closet in the bedroom that I found it. The back of the closet was an old wooden panel, slightly loose at the edges. My hands trembled as I pried it away, revealing a dark, narrow passageway. My breath caught in my throat. I grabbed a flashlight, my heart pounding, and crawled through the opening. The passage led to a small hidden room, a room that hadn't seen daylight in decades. The air was stale, thick with dust. The room was filled with old furniture draped in sheets, and boxes stacked haphazardly. In the center of the room was a small bed, neatly made, as if waiting for someone to return. But it was the walls that caught my attention. They were covered in old photographs, yellowed with age. I shone my flashlight on the pictures, my hand shaking. They were all of the missing tenant. A young woman with long dark hair and a bright smile, captured in moments of everyday life, cooking, reading, laughing. But as I moved the light, I noticed something chilling. In the background of many of the photos, there was a shadowy figure, always lurking just out of focus, its presence dark and menacing. And then I saw the last photo on the wall. It was of me. I stumbled back, nearly dropping the flashlight. My mind raced, trying to make sense of it all. How could there be a photo of me in a room that had been hidden for decades? The door slammed shut behind me, the sound echoing in the small space. I whirled around, heart pounding in my chest, but there was no one there. I was trapped. The whispers started again, louder now, filling the room. They were all around me, coming from the walls, the floor, the ceiling. And this time I could understand them. Stay with us. Stay with us. The air grew colder, the darkness pressing in on me. I tried to push the door open, but it wouldn't budge. Panic surged through me as the whispers grew more insistent, more demanding. I turned to the bed, and that's when I saw it. The figure from the photographs, the one that had been lurking in the background, was now standing by the bed, its face obscured by shadows. It was tall, its limbs too long, its presence radiating malice. Stay with us. The whispers chanted in unison, the figure taking a step closer. I backed up, my breath coming in short, terrified gasps. I had to get out, but the door wouldn't move, and the walls seemed to close in on me. The figure took another step, its form becoming clearer, more solid. I could see its eyes now, hollow and black, filled with an emptiness that made my blood run cold. Stay with us. In a blind panic, I lunged at the door, throwing my weight against it. The wood groaned but held fast. The whispers were deafening now, a cacophony of voices urging me to stay, to join them. The figure was inches away, its cold breath on my face. I could feel its presence, oppressive and consuming, as it reached out a hand, its fingers long and skeletal. With a final, desperate shove, the door flew open, and I stumbled out into the closet, slamming the panel shut behind me. I could still hear the whispers, muffled now, but fading as I backed away, my chest heaving with fear. I didn't waste any time. I grabbed my phone, my keys, and ran out of the apartment, not stopping until I was in my car, my hands shaking so badly I could barely get the engine started. I didn't look back as I drove away, the building growing smaller in my rearview mirror, the whispers still echoing in my mind. I never returned to that apartment. I left everything behind, not caring about the deposit or the belongings I'd abandoned. I didn't even go back to collect my mail. Whatever was in that apartment, in that hidden room, wasn't something I wanted to understand. But sometimes, late at night, when the world is quiet and the shadows grow long, I can still hear it. A faint, distant whisper calling out to me, begging me to come back, to stay with them in the darkness.